Hello everybody and welcome back to another Steel Division 2 video, this time on the subject of 4v4 maps, how they're split up based on players, and what you should do on each front depending on the side that you're on. Full disclosure, the idea for this video actually came from a commenter named Colonel Butthurt, and so any sort of prescience that I show in this video is actually due to him, so all your thanks go to him. That said, I thought it'd be a great idea to actually break down where you should go on a team game map, where the fronts are drawn, and what each point you're fighting for actually consists of throughout the point of the game. As the good Colonel points out, a large part of the learning curve associated with this game is coming into it, figuring out where on each front you're meant to be fighting, what you should send where, so on and so forth. While a lot of that can only be found out by playing the game and learning from your mistakes and from your triumphs, some of it can be avoided in that sort of learning curve and give you sort of a jump start toward learning the game. And so that's my goal today. We'll be starting with the 4v4 maps, as they are probably my favorite maps in the game. Just overall size feels right, the amount of players feels right, and so on, but also because there's the least of them, and this is going to be quite an undertaking. A few quick disclaimers out of the way right off the bat. Disclaimer number one, while I'm going to be breaking down which fronts should be fought over, where you should put your units, so on and so forth, this is not a guaranteed every time thing. Sometimes the person you're fighting against doesn't know where they should send their points, and so overcommits to an area you're not expecting. Sometimes the person you're fighting against doesn't send anything to the proper front at all and actually just double teams one of your allies. So there's going to be a lot of give and take to learning how to adequately react to these situations and whatnot, but I will give you my take on what I would do at the beginning of every match given a certain front or a certain side of the map. Another disclaimer is the fact that I am an American through and through, born and raised here. What this means is I have no idea how to pronounce some of these map names, so you'll have to forgive me if I say something that sounds absolutely ridiculous to some Eastern Europeans or even Central Europeans. With all that out of the way though, let's jump right into my favorite map in the entire game, Lenina 4v4. Something to get out of the way right off the bat is that while I'll be looking at all of these maps from one perspective, you could play as either perspective on either the Allies or the Axis. It's not set in stone that the Allies are on one side and the Axis is on the other. And so I'll do my best to break down where you should be on both fronts regardless of where the perspective is. That said, Lenina is my favorite map in the game simply because it encompasses all of the aspects of the game rolled into one map that sort of lends itself toward having multiple different ways to approach it, and every game that I play here feels fresh and new. On the far left of the map, you have a forested area that's great for sort of mechanized combat. In the middle, we have a gigantic open field as well as two hills that's great for that armored engagement. In the middle, on the right side, we have a city that is great for those sort of, again, mechanized or motorized infantry support and taking that city area. And on the far right, we have two close-in hills that's great for sort of either a defensive line is most often seen here, or sometimes a ballsy push that takes the opposing hill. So let's take a look at all of these from left to right. First up, on the far left, we have the forested area that I had alluded would be great for sort of mechanized combat. You'll notice on the far left of this front, there's a forested area on our side of the map, and on the opposing side, there is a city area. These are rarely ever seen in initial combat. While sometimes you might see an armored push running through that open area, oftentimes people are afraid to do it because they're afraid of being side-shot by AT guns in the forest, or afraid of being flanked by tanks that you've sent into the forest, and so you don't often see those right off the bat. Oftentimes when I'm playing either side, I spend very sparse amounts of points to defend these two locations, whether it be maybe an M42 or PaK-38 to defend this forest on our side, or just a squad of infantry and perhaps a PaK-38 or M42 on the opposing side, where you might see an armored engagement eventually, but not right off the bat. For the side and perspective that we're currently on, the city on the far right of this, the small city encompassing the flag just on the right side of the forest, is rarely seen in combat also, mainly because of its difficulty to get to. Again, enemy players are likely to avoid using that road as they're afraid to be sideshot by the forest until after they've taken the forest, and by then, usually it doesn't really matter because, well, they've taken your entire front. That said, in the light cover that's present on the right side of that city, it's a great place to put, say, an IS-2 or even an anti-tank gun, as it will sit there and more or less shut down the entire road coming in. If you get it into just the right place and the enemy does not bring up an adequate anti-tank gun or support gun to stop that from happening, you'll be able to shut down a large amount of reinforcements that are heading into the forest to come up against you there. What's more, this will again shut down any armored engagement that they're looking to send across that open area, so this is a great side of the map to be on. The other side of the map on this same area, the far right side, has a lot of difficulty actually achieving their light forest in time to do anything helpful. It's worth noting that just how the roads work on this map, the allies on this perspective actually have a greater chance of achieving that forward light forest than the Axis does of getting a solid defensive line up in time. Because of this, a viable strategy is just to rush down that area there and take control of that forward forest and kind of forego taking the actual heavy forested area in the middle. That said, if you do find yourself fighting for the forest, there are two ways to go about it as far as I see. I enjoy fighting for the forest and have a lot of fun actually doing the sort of infantry engagements and the mechanized engagements that you're likely to see here. The NATO divisions, specifically the US and France, have a definite advantage in this area. Their half-tracks are fantastic at pinning down enemy infantry that are less than likely to have an AT gun to stop them. Being that most Axis infantry don't come with a PTRS or PTRD equivalent, you're unlikely to see anything with longer than a 120 or in some instances 250 meter range, and so these half-tracks really do a number on the enemy there. That said, the Axis is not totally caught out here either. The MP44 is fantastic in these engagements, especially because Allied troops with their close-ranged infantry only having about a 100 meter range have to close a bit of open ground between the forests in order to get into that sort of close combat scenario with the Axis troops. Because of this, MP44s wreak havoc on them before they're able to achieve those lines, and so long as you're using your sight lines properly, you won't have a problem here as the Axis. The other way that you can take this area is definitively less interesting, yet much more often seen, and that is off-map the other side of the map into oblivion, the end. That's the whole game plan. I personally have a lot of problems with off-map in this game. I think it is an incredibly boring mechanic, and it lends itself towards more meme gameplay that is patching a hole rather than filling it with something stronger. Oftentimes when I'm being off-mapped into oblivion, it just means that somebody's wasted all of their points on off-map, and whenever my troops are able to move again, I can just sweep through them the same as I was going to anyway, because people don't use it correctly. As a little tangent, the correct way of using off-map is to nuke an area and then rush through and quickly make those surrenders happen, or to nuke an area and have your units push up on it, or so on and so forth. Not to just fire indiscriminately into an area until you're sure that they should all be dead. Either way, I find that off-map is an incredibly boring mechanic, and if you want to learn how to take this forest properly, I think the correct option is to avoid using it as a crutch, but rather as sort of a support to your units. Mortars also do a fantastic job here, as you're able to get them fairly close to the front lines without exposing them to enemy sight lines, and so they fire very quickly and very accurately given that range. Moving on to the second front of Lenina, this one's much more straightforward. I typically send about one squad of infantry to the city on the far left of this area, on either side, be it on the Axis perspective or the Allied perspective. There's also a light forest close to the border on the Axis perspective of this map that you're able to use to really harass enemy infantry or enemy tanks if they should get so bold as to cross over that open area. It is very difficult to hold for either side, as it's kind of smack in the middle of the map. However, if you're able to hold it, you're oftentimes going to get your points worth just in the first few seconds that your units are there. In the right side, oftentimes the most contested side of this front, a few things typically happen, but it's kind of dicey as to whether or not you can take the opposing hill. Oftentimes, if you do achieve the opposing hill, multiple players bear down on you and kind of punish you for pushing too far. While this sort of aggression is great, and oftentimes it really takes pressure off of other allies, it oftentimes doesn't work out, but I don't think you should measure your success here based on what you're able to get ground-wise, rather what you're able to stop the enemy from reinforcing otherwise. If the enemy has to buy 2 planes, for example, to stop your armored push onto their opposing hill, then you've probably made more of a dent into their front lines than you realize, even though your push initially has failed. The decision that you need to make right off the bat on either side of this engagement front is, are you going to be aggressive or are you going to be defensive? If you're going to be aggressive, you should not spend so many points on support guns and AT guns for your hill, as at that point you're kind of betting for yourself to fail, and that's never a great way to go into an engagement. I understand that you should have a fallback plan, however, your fallback plan should not be more than 1 anti-tank gun or perhaps a support gun to sort of fall back to and then reinforce at your leisure. If you spend all your points on anti-tank guns in case you mess up, then your aggression is definitely going to fail, and it's kind of just a waste of points at that point. What's most often seen in this area is a rush for either of these 2 towns in the sort of right middle of this front. These are able to be supported fairly easily from either hill, and so they kind of turn into a bloodbath or a point sink fairly quickly. But if you're able to get there quickly and capitalize on that flag for a few ticks, then it might be worth it. Something that's worth noting is on either side of this engagement, it's a good idea not to let your opponent get too stagnant while you build something up. What I mean by this is if you're going to be aggressive, do not sit on your hill and just build up points, as Lenina punishes this more than most other maps. If your enemy is not fighting anybody actively, they're going to either stock up on artillery, stock up on planes, or they're going to help one of their allies on the fronts that they're losing on. What's more, given the open area and the nature of this front, they have a lot of time to react to whatever it is you do, be it a push of 4 IS-2s across the middle of the map. They have roughly 2 kilometers of lead time to prepare for that before you get somewhere actually dangerous to them. While in this screenshot, the Allies' perspective of the map actually has the more defensible hill, the Axis side of the map actually has the more useful hill, as it's able to bear down support onto the city and oftentimes turn the tide there. Setting up support guns, anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft weapons, or in some instances Sturmtigers, Brumbars, and Grillies on this hill will actually be able to support the entirety of this city from various locations. So I typically keep the support guns moving back and forth on attack moves that are just shift commanded into oblivion. This allows them to just fire down into the city whenever they acquire a target, and any amount of fire that you provide toward that city fight is gigantic, as it's usually not expected from either side. Moving on, we have the city in Lenina, and this one's a little bit trickier than it should be. From the Allies' perspective, you actually have a lot of work to do if you want to stay inside of this city. The Axis perspective of this map has the definitive better areas for infantry to hide in. They have better cover leading up to one of your forward flags over here on this bridge in the river on the right, and they have much better cover and much better support from their hill toward the other forward flag on the left. All that said, you have a much better opportunity to set up an anti-tank gun in this area here, just looking up this road, stopping all further reinforcements. So the flag on the right shouldn't be too much trouble. You'll want to focus most of your efforts on holding that little crossroads there, as well as pushing hard into the opposing flag on the left. Taking this flag is not going to be easy, and so if you have to just settle for holding your flag, that's oftentimes good enough. Bear in mind that the Axis is going to come hard for the forest on the right, and you don't have a lot of great sightlines to stop that from happening. What's more, setting up a tank to watch that area isn't really an option, as the Axis perspective of this map is likely to just set up an anti-tank gun on this hill or this hill just to bear down on any Sherman or Panzer IV depending on the side you're playing. Another thing worth noting is beware the fronts that your units come in on over here. There's another land spawn just off to the right of where the camera stops here, and if you're not careful, spawning in units for the right side of this city might see them taking that road and getting gunned down in the open by an anti-tank gun on the opposing hill. For that matter, always be cognizant of where your units are spawning in any front in any map, because oftentimes that's how you lose a lot of your reinforcements, is just ill-placed reinforcement cards. Moving on to the final front of Lenina, this one is likely to see either the most aggression or the least aggression throughout the entire game. What I mean by this is there are 2 ways to play this area on either side. You can either push really, really hard to take the opposing hill or take the opposing flag if you're on the Axis perspective of this map. Or you can set up a defensive gun line cordon and sort of just support your allies, be it with artillery, be it with planes, or be it with actual units that you're just sending in to support. The road on the right side of this front ends in a bottleneck bridge and turns into a large bloodbath if you're not careful. That said, the Allied perspective of this map actually gets their units into the opposing side of that bridge and onto the opposing flags much faster than the Axis perspective does. So if you have fast vehicles such as American M8s, or in other instances the BT-7, or even quick WLA transports, you're able to fly down this road and unload quickly into that forest and perhaps stymie an entire side. Because of this, regardless of which side of this map I'm playing on, I tend to overcommit to that side of the map. Not necessarily if I'm going to be aggressive or defensive, as I decide that based on the fly, but if you lose the hill that you're meant to be defending on either perspective of this map, you are going to lose that entire front, and it's going to be near impossible to take back. For any players that have played for any length of time, you've seen this map, and you know exactly what happens when the enemy achieves the further forest on the Axis perspective of this map. And moreover, you know what happens when you achieve the Allied perspective of this map. It's just not pretty. It sort of snowballs out of control from there, and they have to commit more than you did in points in order to take it back. What's more, if you undercommit right off the bat and the enemy overcommits, then you're going to lose that side handily and likely never be able to take it back regardless of the amount of points you sink in there. It's sort of an all or nothing front, and because of that, it's a very interesting front. However, it is a very costly front at best. The city on the left side of this front on the Allies' perspective, however, rarely sees any action. So sending one squad of infantry there is oftentimes more than enough, or reinforcing it as you need to later on in the game is more than enough. However, on the Axis side, on the far hill over there, you're meant to send some sort of sniper unit as well as a anti-tank gun of your choosing, or perhaps a support gun, just to try and lock down the opposing Allied fronts, as that will overlook an entire reinforcement corridor. My last piece of advice for this front is to be very careful from the Axis perspective of grouping your units up in one area, as off-map is kind of a killer in this spot. If it comes down and the enemy rushes a quick vehicle such as a Panzer II or a M8 through your units, you're just going to lose a lot of them to surrenders if they're all grouped up and you don't have adequate command. So beware of that. Moving on from Lenina, we have what is probably my least favorite map in the entire game, and by probably I mean it definitely is. This is called Gora Kalwaria, or Gora for short, as I'll be referring to it throughout this video. The reasons this is my least favorite map is mainly because it has a lot of unintentional bottlenecks, it has a lot of ambiguous fronts that aren't easy to fight for, and it lends itself to being very, very prone to snowballing. My hatred of the map out of the way, let's jump right into it from left to right. The left side of this map is where you're most likely to see armored divisions. For whatever reason, King Tiger players love this area, and they do very well here, so I can see why it would be attractive. The open areas and open sightlines sort of lend itself toward heavy tanks punishing the enemy. Oftentimes, this side just turns into sort of a meat grinder of cheap infantry marching across the battlefield to try and accomplish one flag or other, and not really any action occurring other than just shelling those infantry to death. From the Axis perspective of this map, it's very difficult to initially hold the far right forest area, as the Allies actually have an easier time of getting there, and because of that, you're likely to meet a lot of resistance there. So if you don't overcommit to that area, you're likely to lose it right off the bat. What's more, on the Allied perspective of this map, the leftmost forward flag is very difficult to hold also, as the Axis has a much easier time of getting to that forward forest just in front of it, and thus has a much easier time of pinning it down with support and AT. The left side of this area actually has a sort of light forest and heavy forest complement that can be used to drive tanks through to support your ambush on that city there. However, it's kind of just another meat grinder just dressed up as a light forest this time. On this front, it's more important than ever to keep up aggression and keep your enemy on their toes, always making sure to trade efficiently and to make them spend their points. Otherwise, you're just going to end up buried in artillery, watching it all fall down on your units, and that's no fun for anybody. Moving on to the second front of this nightmare map, you have this sort of ambiguous area that you're meant to fight over. From the Allied perspective, every time I play this map, I am always underprepared for whatever's going to come down the left side of this map, and as a result, I'm always trying to play catch-up. The right side of this front is completely impossible to take ground in, as jumping from forest to forest exposes you to MG42 or Maxim fire or sniper fire, and you're just going to lose all your infantry doing so. And the abundance of sort of these spread out heavy forests means that there are AT guns everywhere. While on the left side of this front, there's sort of always a concerted armored push that blows through that area or doesn't, and there's no differentiating between the two. So you're left to always overcommit to this area and plausibly lose another front because of it. Out of all the fronts in this map, this is my least favorite, as it makes almost no sense to me how the actual aggression takes place, and oftentimes it just becomes this sort of meat grinder of tanks dying on the left or infantry dying on the right in order to take absolutely no flags. But if you don't do it, then you're exposing yourself to the artillery screw-inning that I've talked about before. Moving on to the third front, we have the middle right of the map, and this area seems to make a little bit more sense. From the Axis perspective, you're meant to take the city on the far left and defend the city on the middle right of this front. While as the Allied player, you're meant to do the exact opposite, defend the left city and attack the middle city. Because of the placement of forests and the placement of the cities and the roads getting there, this is actually a fairly interesting time, and I wish the rest of the map was balanced around this same idea. A gigantic open road sits sort of perpendicular through the middle of the area here, and so you're meant to defend that, but very rarely is it actually used. It's a very open and deadly road, and there are a lot faster land spawns that lead wherever you want to go. This area is also weirdly easy to defend with anti-aircraft weapons, as the amount of cover that you have to defend them is great, while also leaving them with open line of sights to engage enemy aircraft, so it lends itself to being the least memed of all the fronts. This entire front does kind of lend itself toward an all-or-nothing snowball, however, because whoever takes the opposing city first kind of locks down the opposing spawn and causes a lot of trouble to try and retake one or the other. Our last front on Gora is another weirdly well-balanced one, so I can't complain too heavily about this, but it is sort of another all-or-nothing snowball. From the Allied perspective, it's very easy to defend the city and the forward flag on the left, as you have a city, you have a great road that leads there, and because of these two things, you're very unlikely to see enemy aggression that leads right off the bat there. However, on the right, it's sort of an all-or-nothing engagement. Whoever wins the initial and the subsequent engagement inside of this sort of forward two flags area sort of wins this entire front. Once the Allied perspective starts dumping flame troops into the opposing forest on this front, or vice versa, you're kind of in a bad way, and you're going to have a lot of trouble getting out of this situation. On top of all this, it's very difficult for the Axis player's perspective in this map to actually defend the air corridor, as there's a gigantic forest in the way blocking line of sight from enemy units, which is great, but that forest also blocks the line of sight of your anti-aircraft weapons. So from the Axis perspective of this side, you're likely to just get bombed into oblivion a lot. 6th Airborne really performs well on this side of the map, as they don't really have AA to begin with, so on either side they're going to be just as effective, but on top of that they have all that aircraft and air superiority to really punish the enemy. Another great example of this is 28th Jaeger, or the Group A Hartneck divisions. These perform very, very well on this areas, just because they have access to heavier tanks, be it the Stug or the Tiger in Group A Hartneck's position, have very little in the way of anti-aircraft weapons, but have all the aircraft necessary to really punish the enemy for that lack of defensibility on the air corridor. Moving on, we have Slutsk 4v4. I have sort of a love-hate relationship with Slutsk, and I can't really explain why. It's sort of another one of those maps where you have ambiguous fronts, and this is mainly due to having one too many players, it feels like, in any given location. Oftentimes you see players double teaming the middle area, taking the leftmost hill and the city area as sort of a duo unit, even though this isn't in accordance with the typical flag policy that separates fronts. But I digress, so we'll hop right into the first front on this map, left to right again. On the first front of this map, and the same being on the other side of the map, you're likely to see armored divisions. These open areas lend themselves well to that, and it likely doesn't deviate from that. I once played this area as a 3rd Fallschirmjäger, and I've never been more sad in my life. But that's something that we're striving to learn today. If you ping a front as an armored division that has a city in it, and you have a 3rd Fallschirmjäger division on your team, please let them have the city, for the love of God. They can't take the open ground. They're so sad if they're there, but I digress again. From the Allied perspective, you actually have a lot of trouble getting to the leftmost hill, as your road does this weird wonky intersection that you have to take, and so the Axis player actually gets there first a lot of the time if they spawn in the correct location. The same can be said for the middle hill, where you can get some Resvedka or PTRS or Panzerschreck teams into the area just behind this hill and really stop anything from coming from it. On the rightmost side of this front, you have something of a forest that you have to defend, but it rarely sees any action, so one anti-tank gun and a recon unit is oftentimes more than enough for this area, unless it isn't and there's no telling ahead of time. Something you have to be very careful of as an Allied player on this game, not as the Allied perspective, but as the Allied player, is if you're going up against a King Tiger division in this area, you need to shut that thing down early, and you need to punish them from then on out. If a King Tiger gets into one of these two hills, the game might as well be over, because they're almost impossible to deal with on top of those hills, as they have great line of sight overlooking everything. There's not really any great ambush locations to get them, and you're just going to have a lot of trouble dealing with them if they get into those locations. As an Allied player on this map, I love to sprinkle around Resvedka, Panzerschreck teams, whatever I can to sort of lay mines, as it were, for a King Tiger if I'm going up against them. On top of that, if you're playing one of the divisions on the Axis side that doesn't get access to the long 88s, you're going to have a lot of trouble dealing with the IS-2 in this area, so the same could be said for them. Moving on to our next front, and this front is probably the most contentious, as it were, being that not everybody agrees on where this front actually is. I've sort of given a screenshot of the area that I consider the front to be, but I understand if you think it is just the hill or just the city or so on and so forth. So bear in mind, I understand where you're coming from. I'm just pinging where I think it is. This front is oftentimes where you're going to see the most meat grindery combat. The hill on the left side of this area sees a lot of pushing onto that open area, and if you're able to take that Axis side city, you're going to have a lot of easy times from there on out, pushing outward on that hill. Meanwhile, in the city, the big meat grinder occurs, where there's almost always 750 off-map trucks just bearing down on the area, and so you just don't have a lot of options to fight anything there. That said, medium tanks are fantastic here, as the short line of sights really lend them to not being underpowered versus heavier tanks, and they're going to support infantry fantastically. This is especially true of tanks like the Panzer IV with two MG34s on it, or the Sherman with all 150 Witz guns. Beware the hill on the left if you're pushing from the Allied perspective of this game, as if you allow them to just take that without conquest, you're going to see a lot of support guns and enemy tanks bearing down on your city from there, and you're likely to lose it from that point. One of the greatest successes I ever had on this map was during my week in review of 1st Skijäger, where I was able to get a KV-2 up onto the hill and really punish people inside that city. So beware that happening to you in the future. On the third-ish front of Slutsk, again, this is another contentious pick, but you're able to take this forward hill here, and perhaps you're helping support the city, perhaps you're helping support in the open field on the right, but you're going to be helping somebody on this front. What I like to focus on during this front is making sure on the Allied perspective to take this forward forested area here against the Axis, as that will deny a lot of reinforcements, and much the same as the other hill, you'll be able to set up tanks, anti-tank guns, support guns, and whatever to really support the city fight. I don't really like supporting in the open field, as the open field is typically very one-sided. Whichever side has the heavier armor typically wins. A case could be made, though, to push up this right-hand side of this front and take the forward city over here, as oftentimes, again, being that this front is quite contentious, you're going to be double-teaming somebody right there. On top of this, you're really in no danger of losing any flags if you're fighting on this front, except right there on the right-hand side of this front. Typically, a few squads of infantry and an anti-tank gun or two is more than enough to defend the left side of this front, so take all that with a grain of salt. As an Axis player, you're going to have a lot of difficulty actually pushing up onto this hill and into that city, so I typically avoid doing so. I defend the backward flag and support into the city, or I support into the open field. In our last front of Slutsk, we're going to see more armored divisions slugging it out. On the right-hand side, we have a forest on the Axis perspective that is actually quite defensible from that locale. From the Allied perspective, I rarely ever push to the right side of this front, as you're going to meet a lot of resistance inside those forests. You're going to have a lot of trouble unseating all of those AT guns, especially if you're also getting shot at from the left side of this front. So my focus typically goes toward taking the forward city on the left and then branching out to take the right from there, as you're able to stop reinforcements from getting to that area. From the Axis side of this front, though, you're able to push quite effectively from that forested area. The city on the leftmost side of this front is easily defensible with a few groups of infantry and AT gun or two in the forests, and so you're able to push as a sort of springboard from this forest on the right into the city on the right also. Again though, this front often devolves into whoever has the heavier armor typically comes out the victor, as you're able to take the open field and sort of abuse that with impunity. AA and supply and command chains are very tricky to maintain on this front, as there is just open field. Hiding them behind things is great, but in order to get the most effect out of your AA or your command units, they're going to have to be standing out in the open a lot, and you're going to be risking them as such. This is actually a great front to practice using the M15 SDKFZ7/1 or any other mechanized or motorized anti-aircraft weapon, as moving them constantly is a great habit to get into to avoid counter battery. And on this front, it may as well be a necessity, as you're having to avoid enemy artillery fire as well as enemy anti-tank guns or enemy tanks if you're sort of in an exposed location. God forbid the tanks or infantry in front of those go down, as they're kind of just sitting in the water. Moving on to the second to last 4v4 map, we have Shchedrin. Shchedrin is an interesting map, and I oftentimes have a lot of fun playing here, though there are meme-y aspects to the map. But we'll jump right into it and I'll discuss those as we get there. The first front on this map is likely one of the most frustrating fronts in the game as a whole. It's mainly so frustrating because the meeting engagement on top of this hill oftentimes dictates how this front is going to be played. The French and American decks again really overperform here, as the M8 is just so fast and able to get up there and really punish enemies before they're able to get into position. This side is also very liable to see a lot of off-map attacks or plane spamming, or sort of the worst aspects of this game. I would refer to this front metaphorically as a lot like jousting. You kind of just run 100% of your forces up on top of this hill, you smash them into the other forces, and you hope for the best that you got the better of that engagement. Another option, while being somewhat of a meme still, is just napalming the roads leading up to this on either front. Napalming the roads means that you're going to be able to unload your troops into the correct positions, and you're going to deny the enemy from even getting into those positions. Oftentimes this is the end of this battle. If you plan to napalm and you get a lot of anti-tank guns and support guns into the correct positions on either perspective of this front, you're just going to dominate on this area, and the enemy is going to have a lot of trouble actually catching up to that. That said, if you do lose the hill, a multi-front engagement of medium tanks is probably your best bet of taking it back. So long as you split them up and you're using more than 2 or 3 of them, you're going to have an easy time taking out enemy support guns and anti-tank guns. And then once they achieve the hill, they're going to be very difficult to deal with those sort of meme options, as being that they're spread out, they're less liable to die to aircraft, and you're just going to leave the enemy scrambling. So it's not all bad if you lose the hill all at the start, but it's very important that you don't panic no matter what happens over here. I think that this front is probably the most responsible for early game rage quits out of any front in the game. If you lose it initially, you feel completely helpless to take it back, unless you realize that you can take it back with those sort of medium tank engagements or support engagements or so on. Moving on, we have the second front, and where you're most likely to see a sort of armored engagement from the Allied side, if not so much from the Axis, though Axis armor does go here also. You have a city here that is oftentimes fraught with these sort of meat-grindery combats between enemy infantry and your infantry, but on either side of that city there are light forests that are interesting to fight for, and you have a lot of great support locations if the enemy pushes forward too much. From the Allied perspective, this map, you have the forest back here that's able to house anti-tank guns should the enemy push through the light forest with tanks, or artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, whatever you name it. This is actually a great spot. The Axis perspective of this front actually has a little bit more difficulty getting correct placement of anti-tank guns. However, they do have the better road and the better area to fight for in the city, so take all that with a grain of salt. Moving on to the third front on Shchedrin, this is where you're likely to see your King Tigers. For whatever reason, they're called to this area, and again, they do well here, so I can't criticize that too much. This area is actually really tricky to fight for. As the Allied perspective, you really want to make sure you don't lose the hill and the forest on the right side of this front, so sending a lot of infantry along the rightmost road is essential to getting that area under control. On top of this, the Axis perspective of this front is likely to achieve the hill first and thus get a lot of anti-tank guns or tanks into support range to stop your units from achieving the hill. Because of this, you're going to have to be very careful pushing up onto this hill from the Allied perspective of this map. Oftentimes, your best bet is to just lose the hill initially and then push up onto it as sort of a concerted effort rather than as a rush. This area is also very difficult to hold on to if you take it, as the opposing forests on either side are sort of open to the air of enemy units, and so it's kind of dicey whether or not you can hold them once you take them. Both perspectives of this engagement are capable of supporting the city that's off camera to the right, and so that oftentimes leads to a lot of difference going on in that city fight, with support guns or AT guns bearing down from this hilled area here. And also, from either perspective, half-tracks are kind of the bane of your existence here. If they're able to get in between these two hills and these two forests here, oftentimes they're able to circumvent whatever AT gun is there and really punish enemy infantry. I can't count the number of times that I have or I've seen someone lose this entire hill just because they forgot to bring up an anti-tank weapon to deal with these stupid half-tracks. Our last front on Shchedrin is this gigantic city on the right-hand side, and this one's actually a lot of fun. Decks that overperform here are oftentimes things like 6th Airborne or 3rd Fallschirmjäger, or the sort of really interesting decks that you don't get to see a lot elsewhere. There's a soft spot in my heart for the really expensive German infantry, and so I really enjoy watching 3rd Fallschirmjäger do its work here, or even decks such as 78th Sturm, or any deck that gets access to an absurd amount of MP44s. On top of this, it's very hard to snowball in the city, as even taking one flag or both flags in the city just opens you up to enemy support gunfire or tank fire from the opposing side, so it's very difficult to hold on to it once you take it. What's more, defending this area from the air corridor is quite difficult also, being that you either have to have your anti-aircraft weapons so close to the front that they're in danger of enemy infantry, or you have to have them so far back that they oftentimes don't stop the bombing run. All in all, this is one of my more favorite areas to fight over in the game, as it just lends itself to not being too memey. However, there are those that would just nuke this area with off-map, but they would do that with any area, so I guess that doesn't really count. Moving on, we have the last 4v4 map in the game currently, and that is Ostrowno. This is an interesting map. It's certainly not one of my favorites, but it's also not one of my least favorites, so it's somewhere in between those two. Let's just jump right into the first front though. On the far left side of this map, we have a small city area over on the left, we have a contended forest area in the middle, and a small bridge off on the right hand side. While the bridge on the right oftentimes doesn't see anybody run across it, when it does, it's devastating, so it's oftentimes great to overcommit-ish to this area. I typically send a Panzerschreck team or somebody with an anti-tank gun and a few squads of infantry to hold down this area initially and then see where it goes from there. It's sort of difficult to hold the opposing side of this river if you take it, but it is frustrating to have to retake it from the opposing perspective, so it is a perfectly viable solution to rush across this river and get that early foothold against the enemy and make yourself a nuisance. On the left-hand side from the Allied perspective, you're really not in a great danger of losing any ground. You can defend this hill back here and not lose anything by not sending any infantry into that leftmost town, and oftentimes the enemy has sent infantry there to sort of defend against you. That said, I enjoy pushing for that side as it's kind of a multi-front engagement that splits the enemy's attention, and I always enjoy doing that. Here in the middle area, you're likely to see the most meat grinderiness as you're trying to achieve these opposing forests with anti-tank guns and infantry, and you're supporting them with your heavy tanks or perhaps your medium tanks as you're trying to push for the opposing flag. This is the corridor that you're most likely to fight for during this engagement here. This area means much more than either side of this engagement, so be very, very careful to make sure you don't lose it. Moving on to the second front, we have the city and the small bit of the hill on the right-hand side of the city. While there is a bit to defend over on the left-hand side where there's this huge lake, it oftentimes doesn't see any action. The only time I've ever seen this area contested is when a bunch of Sherman swam across when I wasn't expecting it, and I kind of laughed a lot as they came swimming across. However, most games you're not going to see any contention over here. From the Allied perspective, I like to set up an anti-tank gun here in this forward forest, and from the Axis side, I like to get anti-tank guns and support guns into this forward forest. The city is fairly straightforward as to how you think it would actually go. You kind of just battle over this middle area here, and oftentimes neither flag changes hands. In this, the Axis perspective of this map actually has more of an advantage of pushing through the city and taking the Allied perspective's flag, but it's not like they're going to hold it for very long just due to the amount of support they're able to bring to bear from these forests back here. The hill is going to be a true point of contention, as the Allied perspective is going to have a lot of trouble holding onto this flag if they don't commit enough troops to this area. Moreover, if the Axis perspective doesn't commit just as many troops, if not more, they're going to lose a huge boon in that reinforcement corridor being cut off by anti-tank weapons. If the Axis player loses this forward area here, they're going to also lose the light forest off to the left, and that's a huge spot to put MGs or any support unit to help take the forest or the forward areas there. Moving on to the third front, we have another interesting area where you're unlikely to see much change throughout the perspective of the game. On the far left side, you have a hill area that you're able to take some of the time, but it's not imperative that you do. You're likely to see a lot of anti-tank fire from here though if the enemy does take it on either perspective. In the middle area, there's a flag dead in the center of a crossroads that is almost impossible to take as the Axis player unless you're going to incur heavy losses, because these light forests and heavy forests behind them are oftentimes fraught with anti-tank weapons or with tanks. The true battle is going to occur over this middle hill area, and moreover inside this light forest where this flag is located. Oftentimes this just devolves into a series of airstrikes and artillery strikes and off-map strikes that just sort of reduce the other player to atoms while marching your troops onto the hill just to have the same happen to them a few moments later. But it's imperative that on either side of this front, you don't let the enemy take it uncontested, as that's when you see a lot of anti-tank guns set up, a lot of support guns set up, and they start pushing to either side, and oftentimes they're going to take it if they have that forward position. I would advise that the most patient person on your team take this area, not necessarily a specific deck, as it's just a series of wait until your units all explode, send up more units, wait until their units all explode, they send up more units. If you're able to push through, it is very cathartic, but it oftentimes doesn't happen before the game is decided on another front. So this area here is not going to be overwhelmingly integral to the whole war effort on this map. However, it is still very important to contest. Lastly on this map, we have the far right area where you're likely to see a lot of armored engagements. The Axis perspective of this map is going to try to push down the far right road and just take that flag in the open there, while the Allied perspective is going to try and shift their attention to the middle left and take the forward light forested area on the hill opposing. That said, it's imperative that neither side give up these two forward forests here, as those are great jumping off points for making an armored push for either location. If your enemy has heavier tanks than you, regardless of which side you find yourself fighting for on this map, then always make sure to not take engagements on their terms. Don't take engagements at 2 kilometers against a King Tiger, for example. Instead, try your best to ambush them and sort of circumvent them, as it were. What's more, it's very important to remember on this front that if you do lose this forward flag as the Allied or as the Axis perspective on either side of this road, then it's not the end times. However, you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to retake those. It's important that you remain patient, you remain calm, and realize that it is only one flag in the scheme of things, and they haven't gotten too much from you in that regard. What's more, the closer that they push up on either side of this map, the closer they are to your air corridor, and thus more likely to be punished by yourself and your allies in their air force. All that said, that is going to do it for this video on the 4v4 maps available in Steel Division 2. I applaud you if you were able to make it to the end of this video, because this has been a tremendously long video. Even though it's been so long though, I'm sure I missed a lot of things, and the issue is that all of these fronts are going to be very dynamic in the way that they're played. With very few exceptions, you're going to see a variance in every single front depending on the deck you're playing as, the deck you're fighting against, the player you're playing against, and how experienced you are at manipulating these sort of dynamic fronts. Because of this, the only true way to learn each of these fronts is to play them enough to understand how things typically go. The best that I can do for you is intelligently inform you as to where you can put things, where the roads let out in intelligent ways, and how you can quickly and violently expose an enemy's weakness. Depending on the acceptance of this video, I will be heading into the 3v3 and 2v2 maps and probably breaking those up into parts, as this video is much longer than I thought it was going to be as it is. Being that there are a lot more 3v3 and yet more 2v2 maps in the game, it'll take me a lifetime if I break them down in one video for each type, so we'll likely break those up more. But hey, if you're still here, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you've learned something.